In Meditation 5, Descartes gives us a second proof for the existence of God. Maybe he thinks we might not have quite understood that first proof for the existence of God. In fact, the third meditation proof seems to be so convoluted that there have been scholars who doubted that Descartes even believed it himself, who suggested that Descartes was an atheist. We know that Descartes did withhold writings. He was aware that Galileo had been jailed for his writings, and Descartes was indeed afraid of the same thing possibly happening to himself. He was certainly not a friend of the church or the theologians. He saw theology as irrelevant and as an impediment to the advance of science. So he really wanted to marginalize theology, that's clear. But does he reject his own proof for the existence of God in the third meditation? It's hard to say. I don't think we can know that. On the one hand, we see that the proof is one that probably persuaded no one, if indeed Descartes persuaded himself of it, which we don't know. And so we could see that why people might think that Descartes himself sort of planted that as an indication that this was in fact not something to be taken seriously. On the other hand, we cannot dismiss the fact that that argument in the third meditation supplies a very significant step in Descartes' argument as a whole. Without it, his whole argument collapses altogether. Because after the second meditation, when Descartes is convinced of the indubitability of his own existence, he needs some way to be able to affirm evidence about other truths that pertain not to what's going on in his own mind, but that pertain to the rest of the world. And God is going to supply that bridge for him. Since God is an infinite being, and therefore perfect, and since deception is a lack, a deficiency, and therefore incompatible with perfection, God cannot be something like the evil deceiver. God can't be deceiving us. And this is going to be key to Descartes getting further. For one thing, we see that the proof of the existence of God for Descartes takes care of the evil deceiver argument. Right? Even the evil deceiver can't deceive me about my own existence, because as long as I'm doubting, I'm aware of the actual presence of thought going on in my mind. But the evil deceiver could still be interfering with those thought processes and preventing me from thinking clearly, causing me to make mistakes every time I tried to calculate something or reason about something. However, if God cannot be a deceiver, then that shows that I can indeed have faith and trust in my own powers of reason. And this is a conclusion that's actually very important to Descartes. While his argument for the existence of God is central to his whole project, right, to the whole course of the argument of the meditations as a whole, this allows him to say that because God is perfect, we can trust our own God-given powers of reason, and that's all that we actually need in order to understand the workings of nature. We don't need the reports from the theologians. We don't need ancient philosophy. We don't need the Aristotelian interpretation of nature. All we need is the book of nature itself, to open that up and to read it following the proper methods. So anyway, Descartes does give us a second proof for the existence of God, and this is in the fifth meditation. Now this proof is not Descartes' original. He's taken a proof that has been around and that has convinced very few people, but perhaps more people than Descartes' third meditation proof. So I'm not going to go through the fifth meditation, but what I am going to do is to give you a little background about this proof And then you can take that background and look back at Meditation 5 and see how the argument in Meditation 5, because it's phrased somewhat differently than I'm going to put it here, you can go back and see how that matches up with this. Now this argument that Descartes gives in Meditation 5, this is from Saint Anselm, philosopher of the 13th century, a monk, and it has been dubbed the Ontological Argument. Anselm didn't call it that, Descartes didn't call it that. This is a name that was given to this argument by Immanuel Kant. It's really probably kind of a lousy name for the argument, but it stuck. So this is the ontological argument for the existence of God. And we can see why it would appeal to Descartes. It is indeed an a priori argument. It depends not upon any kind of observation or evidence. It depends entirely upon a kind of logical reasoning. So now Anselm's formulation of this argument goes something like this. Even the atheist has a conception of God, right? Because the atheist has to have a conception of God in order to deny the existence of God, after all. What is that conception of God? Well, in Anselm, it is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So, the idea of a perfect being. Now, let us imagine, to understand this, let us imagine two potential concepts of God. God concept 1, God concept 2. God concept 1 has all of the standard divine perfections. God 1 is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, of course, omniscient, for sure, and he's got all of the other omnipredicates that you might want to add to that. And our God concept number 2 has all of those same properties, those same predicates, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, etc., as God concept number 1, with the addition of existence. Now, the question is, which is more perfect? A God that has all of these properties but doesn't exist, or a God that has all of those properties and does exist? Well, since existence is a perfection, and that seems to be another big assumption there, since existence is a perfection, then one of two things is happening if you deny the existence of God, according to Anselm's argument. Either you are denying the existence of God as conceived in God concept number 1, in which case it's not God that you're denying the existence of, because that's not truly the concept of a most perfect being. Or you're denying the existence of the God represented by God concept number 2, in which case you are contradicting yourself, because you are conceiving of a God that exists but also that doesn't exist, since the conception posits the existence of the God and your denial denies the existence of the God. This is a self-contradiction, therefore it follows logically that God must exist. Now, objections were raised against Anselm by his contemporaries, by another monk by the name of Ganelon, who objected to Anselm's argument by means of a counterexample. He asked you to imagine the most perfect island. Okay? And so we can fill in our perfect island attributes. It's got beautiful temperate waters. It's got nice coral reefs with some clownfish that you can go snorkeling and watch. It's got, of course, some freshwater sources, plenty of food, bananas and palm trees and coconut trees and other good things growing on the island, so you won't go hungry for anything. Tame animals and beautiful sun shining above, and you can go on and on and on. You can fill up lots of perfect island predicates, I'm sure. Now, ask yourself, which is more perfect, the perfect island that exists or the perfect island that doesn't exist? Obviously, since existence is a perfection, especially when we're talking about perfect things like perfect islands, then it must exist. Otherwise, you'd be contradicting yourself. Therefore, let's pack our bags forget about Descartes, and go off for find our perfect island. Now, evidently, this does not demonstrate that the perfect island actually does exist. So, that seems to be an argument by counterexample. The argument that God must exist on pain of logical self-contradiction follows the same sort of reasoning. What's the response of an Anselm or another thinker who's persuaded by the ontological argument? The response is that this objection is indeed a valid objection against any argument of this sort except God. It's different in the case of God because here you're talking about an infinite being. The perfect island is perfect dependent upon the waters around it, the sun above it, and all kinds of other contingencies that are not intrinsic to that island itself. Whereas God is the idea of an infinite and all-perfect being dependent on nothing outside of itself. So Anselm wants to suggest that this objection doesn't in fact apply to his argument. So this is the source of Descartes' employment of the ontological argument. So think about that and then go back and read the fifth meditation again and see how that applies and how Descartes formulates his version of the ontological argument. Schluss. That was one take.